What I want to discuss is the role of food regulation in international trade. I'm going to remind you that this has been one of the key debates around trade agreements in Europe. I'm thinking particularly of the so-called TTIP agreement, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement negotiations, which are going on between Europe and the United States, and which, particularly in German-speaking Europe, Germany and Austria, were really opposed by citizens, partly or mainly because of the fear that it was likely to lead or could lead to a reduction in food standards. And the sort of, in German, Chlorhühnchen, the sort of chlorinated chicken, which of course has also emerged in the Brexit debate, is a symbol of that. And I have a great quote here from Pascal Lamy. Pascal Lamy was the EU Commissioner for Trade for some time. He was also Director General of the World Trade Organization, so somebody who's had a lot of experience in international trade negotiations. And essentially he sort of gave a lecture a year or two ago where he was contrasting, if you like, the old issues of trade policy, where the obstacles to trade were about protecting domestic producers from foreign competition. Of course, we still see that. Michael mentioned Mercosur and the concerns that Irish beef producers have about opening up to competition from Latin America in that area. But he says the new world is a world where essentially we have production taking place within these global supply chains, and where the obstacles to trade are much more about protecting the consumers from risk. So regulatory issues are now, in a sense, become much more important in discussing trade agreements. So, sort of the two questions I want to pose. We know the European Union is negotiating a much broader range of trade agreements now than in the past. I mentioned America, but we also have Mercosur, negotiations beginning shortly with New Zealand, with Australia. We've signed agreements with Canada, which have just come into force. So, how have food safety issues been addressed in those agreements, and are there any lessons from that for the potential trade relationship which we will have with the United Kingdom following Brexit? So that's the sort of structure of the presentation. This slide is really just to confirm what Michael has already mentioned to you, that food regulations potentially, of course, they're there to protect consumers. But nonetheless, they do have trade effects. And we call them, as economists, we call these sort of non-trade measures, because they're not tariff barriers, but they can, of course, raise the costs of engaging in international trade, and at some stages they can also be prohibitive. So, for example, if we ban the import of hormone-treated beef from countries that use that. So there is this balance, if you like, between regulation which we accept is necessary and is desirable for the protection of consumers, but then regulations which maybe go beyond that and which actually take on this sort of protectionist bent. And of course, that's a particular problem in the food safety area. If one party holds the view that a particular measure which the importing country has adopted is disproportionate to the level of risk, and therefore they would argue is indeed a protectionist measure and not a food safety measure. So this has become an area of great interest to trade economists for a number of reasons. First of all, over the post-war period, tariffs as a trade barrier have become less and less important. And if you ask businesses what are the main barriers now to sort of getting in, particularly food businesses, to getting into overseas markets, they will highlight regulation and regulatory barriers as now much more important. Of course, we're going to be focusing here mainly on sort of public regulations, so the regulations that are set down in legislation. Michael highlighted the great importance of sort of private labels and the power that private firms have to set food standards, but that's something which is, in a sense, outside our immediate remit. And just to sort of highlight, in the course of sort of analysing the consequences of a potential trade agreement with the US, been a number of studies which have tried to measure and to quantify what might be the gains from reducing some of these regulatory barriers. And one way that economists try to do this is to express the degree of friction, if you like, caused by regulatory differences between countries, and to express it as if it were a sort of a percentage tariff, to try to sort of put it into similar a similar framework. And if we think that, for example, Europe, which is quite high tariff protection, but that would be on average maybe about 15%. For foodstuffs, you can see that from three different studies that I've chosen here, you can see that the impact of these regulatory differences much more significant than traditional tariff barriers. So how might we address these regulatory differences in international trade? And OECD has suggested a sort of hierarchy of measures, a sort of a ladder, ranging from fairly soft law, so this would be at the top of the slide, where we might have an agreement that our regulatory authorities would interact with each other, that they would inform the other party if they were thinking of introducing a new regulation. They might give the opportunity for comment from other regulatory bodies to make sure that any trade consequences would be addressed, at an early stage. We might go further. We might commit to adopting good regulatory practice. So that would include things like transparency, giving stakeholders the opportunity to comment on revisions or new regulations, conducting impact assessments of regulatory changes. So we might commit to that in terms of a trade agreement. We might have mutual recognition of conformity assessment, which is something which the EU would be quite used to doing. So here, for example, we would, the Food and Veterinary Office, for example, would go to Brazil and would certify that the systems that the Brazilian authorities have in place for certifying that beef exported from specific processing plants in Brazil meet the European standards. We would accept those certificates. We would accept that the implementation system in Brazil is good enough that we can rely on those certificates. So that would be an example of mutual recognition. It's not saying that Brazil has to have the same standards as Europe, but what it's saying is that any meat exported from Brazil is certified to meet the European standards. So we still have different standards. It's recognizing the certification process. At the very top of the process, the hierarchy, we have harmonization of standards, which of course is what we have within the European Union, within the single market, where we have a basic level of sort of high standards which are agreed. Of course, member states are at liberty to have higher standards, which they can insist for their own producers, but they cannot keep a product which is lawfully put on the market and put into circulation in other member states. They cannot keep that out of their market. So that's sort of the most integrated level of regulatory cooperation. And then you have sort of a little bit lower than that, so that's the second one from the bottom, is what we would call regulatory equivalence. So this is where two countries agree that they are trying to achieve the same level of protection for consumers, but they accept that they may have different means, different measures to try to implement that same level of protection. And we'll see that is quite important in the Brexit context. So these are the sort of options that we might have. Of course, the sort of basic framework that all countries which are members of the WTO would accept is the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary standards, which sets out some core principles. Usually free trade agreements go beyond, they add to the basic WTO principles, but it's important perhaps to see these as the foundation. And under the SPS agreement, it recognizes that WTO members have the right to take necessary sanitary and phytosanitary measures. but that the regulations should be necessary to achieve a genuine policy objective, and they should be based on scientific principles. And then you have a series of principles which are designed to implement that non-discrimination. You can't apply different rules to imports from different sources. You should try to base your regulations on international standards, codex standards, where possible. You should acknowledge the principle of equivalence, so that if an exporting country asks for you to recognize their standards as equivalent to yours, you should engage in that process to see whether that is the case or not. Transparency, so if you introduce new rules and regulations, you should make those easily available to exporters from other countries so that they know the rules they face. And consistency, so in other words, that if you try to achieve a certain level of protection in terms of risk, that should be consistent across different areas. So that's the basic sort of fallback position, if you like, that countries have signed up to. In the TTIP negotiations, we saw a big pushback from consumer and NGO groups based on a number of fears. That, first of all, that if we engaged or we negotiated a free trade agreement, that this would result in competitive pressure from lower standards or what Europeans would consider lower standards in the United States, and that farmers here would essentially come under this competitive pressure, would complain, and that would lead to an erosion of the high level of protection which we see we have in Europe. There was concern that if you open up the regulatory review process to stakeholders in other countries, and particularly large, perhaps US businesses, that again would bias the regulatory decision-making process in Europe. And that even the possibility that your regulations could be challenged might lead to a sort of a regulatory chill, that it might slow down or minimize the efforts made within Europe to try to protect European consumers. And indeed, a sort of more general fear that food safety decisions would be taken by trade officials in the context of a trade agreement rather than by the normal regulatory authorities. And so just to sort of make the point as to how the European side was tried to address this issue in the TTIP text. Of course, these negotiations, they've slowed down, as Michael has said, under the new American president, but in principle they're still going. So we have a text from the European side. We don't know whether this, of course, would be agreed ultimately by the American side if such an agreement were to come about. And what's interesting here is that the EU actually revised very considerably its proposal on regulatory cooperation, including food safety regulation, in response to the concerns that I showed in the previous slide. So basically the structure of TTIP is that you'd have a regulatory cooperation chapter, you then have specific chapters on SPS measures, technical barriers to trade and so on, and then you'd have a set of annexes attached to the agreement where the two sides had agreed on sort of regulatory equivalence. And as I say, there was quite a dramatic change. But under the EU proposal, and just to summarize it very briefly, it would establish that countries had the right to maintain their own levels of protection, that regulatory cooperation was desirable, but it was voluntary. It would be up to the regulatory authorities, EFSA in the European Union, Food and Drugs Administration in the US, to decide if they saw a benefit in trying to cooperate, particularly with respect to regulating, say, new technologies where we don't have standards in place at the present time. It did propose to follow general principles of good regulatory practice, which I've set out. It did propose a sort of effective institutional mechanism, so a sort of a joint committee which would try to address regulatory differences and regulatory problems when they emerged, but it was quite clear that this joint committee would not have powers to actually change regulations. This could only be done through the normal process in each jurisdiction. And importantly, it set out that this particular chapter would not be subject to dispute resolution. In other words, the US could not take a dispute against the EU on the grounds that it wasn't following the commitments that it had accepted. So just to maybe take 2 or 3 minutes just to try to bring this back to Brexit, which I think is probably what is on most people's mind. And we know that what the United Kingdom has indicated, it wishes to leave both the customs union and the single market, and it has promised no hard border and no physical infrastructure on the island of Ireland. And we have 3 possibilities when it comes to March of 2019, which is 2 years after the triggering of the exit process. The most positive outcome is that the UK leaves with a withdrawal agreement, plus a transition period in which we would continue to negotiate our future relationship, because I think we all accept that this is not going to happen within the next 18 months. We simply cannot sign a full free trade agreement within that period. So the negotiations would continue, and in my view, the only plausible way in which we would have that transition period is indeed if the United Kingdom were to simply remain within the European Union, which is possible under the Article 50 process. We can have a withdrawal agreement which puts the Brexit date, say, 3 years ahead. Huge problems both politically in Britain and in the European Union to accept that. But if we don't accept that, then maybe we do have an agreement on the withdrawal, but we don't have a transition. And we come to this cliff edge in 18 months' time. What happens at border posts? What happens with customs? Because simply the infrastructure has not been put in place and cannot be in place to address trade if we don't have that transition period. Of course, in the worst case outcome, the negotiations break down and Britain simply leaves in a disorderly Brexit. So we do face potentially customs clearance checks, but from the food point of view, also border checks for regulatory compliance. Now, it is true that when Britain leaves, it will have exactly the same standards as we do have in the EU, and it has proposed that it would sign a sort of regulatory equivalence agreement. Now, remember that hierarchy of cooperation. It's not saying that it will maintain exactly the same standards, but it will maintain the same level of, the same objective of food safety, but it leaves open the possibility that it might wish to change the means by which it achieves those standards. Whether the EU would agree to that, so far we have only done agreements with full regulatory cooperation, effectively with the European Economic Area countries and Switzerland, countries that have accepted the full European acquis. So they have accepted that they will adopt the legislation which we adopt in the food safety and animal health areas. The one interesting sort of discrepancy there, so for example, what I mean by that is that Switzerland and Norway at their borders apply exactly the same rules to imports coming into their countries as we would do here in Ireland. So they have agreed to adopt exactly the same rules as the EU. The one difference is that Switzerland actually does allow hormone-treated beef, which is an interesting sort of exception, given that that's something that could occur if the UK were to sign a free trade agreement with the US. The only example I could find where the EU has entered into a regulatory equivalence agreement, so not a harmonization but equivalence, is quite a deep agreement with New Zealand, recently revised. But even there, even though we agree that New Zealand has the same animal health standards as we have in Europe, nonetheless, New Zealand imports, when they come to Europe, they have to come through a border inspection post. so they can't just come to any port, and there is still a frequency of checking, physical checking. It's less than the normal rates, 20% for meat and 50% for milk products, but nonetheless there are still those checks. So getting that equivalence agreement, it seems to me, it could be problematical. So just to sort of draw the pieces together, yes, on Brexit Day, the UK and the EU will have the same regulatory standards, but from a trade point of view, that in itself is not sufficient. The European regulatory authorities will need to satisfy themselves that those standards are being met. So there is a sort of a further stage. And of course, from the UK point of view, if we're exporting into the UK, they say they're going to replicate the EU legislation initially. So presumably, we will also have to demonstrate compliance with standards if we wish to continue trading with the UK. Whether the sort of regulatory equivalence idea, it's really a trade-off. How far will the UK be prepared to bind itself in terms of the changes it can make to its regulations in the future? And how far does it wish to have the freedom to make those changes? That's a trade-off with the degree of market access I think that the European Union will be willing to provide. I think the lesson from the TTIP experience, and to those of us who are interested in trying to minimize and avoid these regulatory barriers, particularly on the island of Ireland, is that we need to bring consumers with us. It's not just a producer issue. Consumers are concerned that trade agreements can be used to lower standards, so we need to assure consumers that whatever deal is reached doesn't compromise their food safety and food security. And just the final sort of point is that we're discussing this issue here in Dublin this morning. For us, it's a really existential issue in a sense, but be aware that looking for special agreements and so on may fall on somewhat deaf ears in the rest of Europe, where the Brexit issue is perhaps doesn't have the same priority and the same urgency as it may have for us. So those would be the thoughts I'd leave with you, Mike. I've two sort of pieces of further reading. Yesterday, I presented at the ComAgri in the European Parliament a paper on sort of Brexit and transition arrangements, which you can download on the net. And then I did a small piece for Safe Food on regulatory equivalence, which you might find of interest.